Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Muhammad Ali, as many of you know, just passed away recently, and one of his most famous quotes is, "It's hard to be humble when you're as great as I am." And there's probably a lot of truth to that statement. Can you imagine being considered the greatest boxer of all time and still trying to stay humble through all that? Can you imagine being one of these basketball players who's about to play Game 7 tonight in the NBA Finals, and you've got people wearing around your jersey all over town, people hashtagging your name all over social media, talking about you, patting you on the back, wishing you good luck, everybody in town. Thousands of people packing an arena, millions of people watching on TV. Can you imagine how hard it might be to stay humble when everybody is telling you how great you are and how smart you are and how beautiful you are, whatever it might be? Can you imagine running for president and people have your name in their yards? They're wearing your shirts. They're talking about your slogans. They're campaigning for you. I don't care who you are. It's hard to stay humble when it seems like you've got so many fans and so many supporters and so many people seem to be following you. I want you to compare, though, Muhammad Ali's quote to another great sporting celebrity. That's John Wooden. And John Wooden once said this. He said, "Talent is God-given, so be humble. Fame is man-given, so be grateful. And conceit is self-given, so be careful." We aren't here, though, to get you to take sides with any sports celebrity, though I think for most of you with a biblical background, you understand which of these quotations might be closer to the biblical standard of humility. These people, whether it be John Wooden or Muhammad Ali or whoever it is, quoting about humility, they're fallible humans, but we do know and need to know that there's lots of places in God's Word that tell us to be humble. We can look at passages like what we read in Matthew chapter 18, 3 and 4. It says, "Unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." A lot of times we read that passage, and one of the things that we note about it is that to be humbled as a little child is to have the trust of a little child, to have the obedient spirit and teachable spirit that little children often have, children who ask questions, who are willing to accept your answers at face value. It says if you're not willing to humble yourself as a little child does, then you certainly aren't going to enter the kingdom of heaven. But if you do humble yourself, you will be greatest in the kingdom. Matthew 23:11, Jesus says here, "He who is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled. He who humbles himself will be exalted." And in 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter speaks of humility. He speaks to younger people. Sometimes when we're young, we're strong, we're in good shape. We might be starting to experience some educational success. We're in our prime in terms of we're good looking and handsome, hopefully. So that can lead to arrogance and overconfidence and pride. He says, "You younger people, though, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble." And in James 4:10, James says, "Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up." The key to spiritual victory is humbling ourselves. Humbling ourselves doesn't mean that we don't think highly of ourselves. Doesn't mean that we're not confident either. C.S. Lewis once said, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. And I think that might be a good idea as to what humility is. But perhaps the best example of humility is found in Scriptures in a passage in Philippians chapter 2. And I want to spend some time in Philippians 2 as we try to look at a good example of humility. We could probably look at some characters throughout history who have demonstrated moments of humility. They've seemed to have had some acts of humility. But no better example can be found in all of history than the humility of Jesus Christ, which you read about in Philippians chapter 2. So if you were to define humility, not with a textbook definition, not with someone else's quotation, if you were to define it by looking at the perfect example of humility, I think you need to go no further than Jesus Christ. It looks like Jesus. You want to know what humility looks like? It looks like Jesus. So take a look at Philippians 2, and let's begin in verse 3. Now keep in mind, the church of Philippi may have been having some problems with not getting along, quibbling over some issues. A lack of unity may have existed. A bit of pride may have been a problem in Philippi. And so Paul is asking the church to take a look at someone who is an example of humility, the very opposite of pride, so that they might use his example as a starting point so they could start getting along. Philippians 2 and verse 3, here's what he says to Philippi: do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit. Do nothing. Don't do anything out of selfishness. Don't do anything out of conceit. But in humility, count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. In other words, he didn't yearn for the credit and the fame and the glory. He says he didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped. He didn't reach for it. Instead, this was his attitude. He emptied himself. And he took the form of a servant. He was willing to serve. He didn't ask or have to be worshipped as king while he was here on earth. He took the form of a servant. And being born in the likeness of men, being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Of course, later in the text it says God has now highly exalted him, and he has a name which is above every name. What did Jesus do in order to demonstrate humility to us? We read that he humbled himself, but what were some of the things that he did? Well, I would notice to you verse 3, the phrase in verse 3. Jesus, when he came to earth, and this is a description of Jesus when he left heaven and came to earth, Jesus did that because he counted others as more significant than himself. Because he valued you more than he valued his own glory, he came to earth to die for you, to serve you and me. Jesus counted others as more significant than himself. What did he do in coming to earth? Well, our spiritual victory is worth his suffering, and so in order for him to come to earth and to live as a man, he emptied himself. He humbled himself, verse 7 says. And this, I think, is a description of the process of him leaving heaven. This is a place of glory. And he's living on earth, a place of trials. He is leaving the riches, the grandeur, the glory of heaven. It's as if he is emptying his pockets of all wealth, and he's saying, I'm going to live as a servant down here on earth, a place of trials. I'm leaving glory to live on earth and to face trials. Think about it as you think about Jesus and how he emptied himself or humbled himself. Jesus went from being Lord of all, can you imagine? Lord of all. Through him, the heavens were made. Lord of all, the creator of all, to being born in a manger full of straw. Imagine waking up to that scene, being the center of the universe in heaven, and then coming to earth and being born in a lowly manger. and then being taken to some lowly city, the city of Nazareth, and then having to be subject to parents. I mean, you were on an equality with God, the Father in heaven. You were on a par with Him, and you came to earth. Jesus comes to earth, and we read in Luke chapter 2 that when He got lost in Jerusalem and Mom and Dad came back searching for Him, and they told Him, hey, you need to rejoin the party, come back home. He was subject to His parents. At one point in time, He's the ruler of all, and now Mary and Joseph, He has to listen and obey them here on earth. Jesus went from being someone who was helping distribute the law, giving the law, to someone who was under the law. Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4 describes the scene. It says in verse 4 that when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth His Son. And His Son was born of a woman and was born under the law. Under the law. He's not over the law now. He came to earth to live by the law, to obey it, subject to it. He's born of a woman, born under the law to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. Jesus went then from a place of glory to a place of trials, and that was certainly an emptying of Himself. It was a lowering of Himself, a humbling of Himself. As in doing so, He took the form of a servant. He had to be born in a different form. That's what happened to Jesus when He came to earth. Jesus was not human flesh when He was in heaven. He came to earth and took upon Himself human flesh. It's what we call the incarnation, is the fancy word for it. But He takes upon Himself in Greek, as you read here in Philippians chapter 2, the word is schema. The idea is he takes upon Himself a new outward form. It's a word that gets used for us as we change forms. We go from being a baby. Jonna was just talking about Samuel today, when she remembers when he was a little baby and holding him and how he would just lay on my chest. Now he's about as tall as I am. He's changed schema. He's gone from this little tiny thing that was in the hospital that we hung out with for 18 days because he was a little preemie, to, this tall, nasty thing that he is now. He's changed schema. He's changing form. And someday he will be my dad. I was sitting at my dad's house, and we were talking. And he just interrupts the conversation, which he does all the time. But he interrupts the conversation as, "You're getting a lot of gray hair." And he looks at my brother Dave, my twin brother. He says, "And you're going bald. What's going on with you guys? I'm getting old. You're getting old." Yes, we're getting old. We're changing schema. That's how I like to put it. We're changing schema. So Jesus, when He comes to earth, He changes form. And He takes the form of a bondservant, a slave is the idea. Matthew chapter 20, verses 27 and 28. Matthew 20, 27 and 28. It says, "Whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give His life a ransom for many." Jesus comes here to serve. He had the right to dictate to others and to command and to demand glory and honor and worship, but He didn't. He came here and He served other people. Took upon Himself the form of a servant. In John chapter 13, you read about another example of that. We're going to get to that in a minute, so we won't go there now. But He took the form of a servant. And then we also read, here He is, born in the likeness of men. The idea is that Jesus is now in our likeness, not just in physical form, mind you, but something had to have changed when it comes to the very nature of Jesus, and that Jesus is now able to be tempted. We read in the book of James that God cannot be tempted by evil. So in what way did Jesus change form? Well, clearly when He comes to earth, He's also temptable. He has the ability to sin. Jesus never sinned. He never gave in to that sin, but He had the ability. He chose not to. It says in Hebrews chapter 4 that He was tempted in all points, like as we are, yet without sin. He overcame it. Took the form of a servant, took upon Himself our nature, and yet still overcame the temptations that he was faced with. So he becomes a servant in the likeness of men in those senses as well. Takes upon himself flesh, but also all of the things that come with being flesh. Being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death. Part of his humility was he was obedient. We, of course, read where Jesus often prayed to his Father in heaven, and he said to his Father in heaven while he was, prior to going to the cross, "Father, if it be thy will, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but thine be done." What does that suggest to you? Well, he was obedient to his Father in heaven. And he was obedient even to the point of death. Even if it meant he had to die, Jesus was willing to obey. So what do we see here are 4 traits in Jesus Christ of humility. Well, humility, if you look at the word humility, some people have noted that the letter U comes before I. And that's a principle of humility. It's where you come before I, or as this phrase says, as when others are more significant than ourselves. That's one principle. Jesus counted us as more significant than himself and what he wanted to do. Second aspect is you empty yourself, you humble yourself. Third aspect, you take the form of a servant, you're willing to serve. And the fourth, Jesus was obedient. A humble person is willing to obey where obedience is necessary and important. This is what humility looks like as we see it in Jesus. Well, what might humility look like in us? And I just want to notice a few things with you as we think about this lesson and apply it to our own lives today, about what humility looks like in us as humans. First thing that I want you to note as you ask this question is the person who is humble knows their limitations and they know their weaknesses. A humble person knows that they have limitations and they have weaknesses. Look at Romans chapter 12 and verse 3. Paul, as he writes to Rome, and the church at Rome, he says to them in verse 3, he says, "I say through the grace given to me to everyone who is among you." He doesn't exclude anybody from that list. Men, women, rich, poor, Jew, Gentile, doesn't matter. Elders, members. He says, everyone who is among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. We need to know that we have limitations and then we have weaknesses. 2 Corinthians 12 verse 10, Paul says this when he speaks of his thorn in the flesh. Even Paul, this great apostle, he says, there was a messenger of Satan that was sent to buffet me. It was a thorn in the flesh. He tried to figure out why he wanted to stop, but he said maybe it was just to humble me. He says, because there's one principle I learned: when I am weak, then I am strong. It made me realize that I have limitations, that I have weaknesses, and that I am in need of God's grace for my weaknesses and for my limitations. So one of the first parts and aspects of being a humble person is knowing that we need help sometimes, and that we're not perfect, and that we have weaknesses and we have needs, and we need the strength of others, and most importantly, the strength and the grace of God. We need to know our limitations and our weaknesses. James 5 and verse 16, that's why it's so important that we keep in mind what James says. He says, confess your trespasses to one another, that you may be healed. Because we make mistakes, we have weaknesses, we have limitations, and we need to be willing to confess those things so that we can get healing and prayer from one another for those problems. Now, when we know our limitations and we know our weaknesses, here's what's also going to happen. When you admit that I have sinned and I have fallen short of God's glory, and I am certainly not a perfect person, and I am in need of God's grace and God's teaching, then here's the second thing that's going to happen with you, is when you know those things, you are going to welcome correction. And so a humble person who knows that they have limitations and weaknesses and they fail, they are going to welcome correction from others when they are in a situation where they have failed. When they have not acted as they should, when they have not spoken as God expects them to speak, when they have not been the person God wants them to be, and someone rebukes them and tries to correct them and get them on the right path, they are going to welcome that. Humble people welcome correction. Look at Proverbs 15. Proverbs 15, verses 31 through 33. The word humility is used in this context. I want you to notice it's the context of someone correcting one and rebuking one who is headed down the wrong path. Proverbs 15, verse 31, the ear that hears the rebukes of life will abide among the wise, but he who disdains instruction despises his own soul. He who heeds rebuke gets understanding. The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. A humble person is willing to receive the instruction of wisdom. You aren't perfect, you aren't fallible, you need help, and therefore when someone is trying to help you, receive it. Listen to it. We need instruction. We need to have a teachable spirit. In Luke chapter 18, Jesus gives us the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And do you remember who he was speaking to there? He was speaking to those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. They didn't feel as though there was much they had done wrong. They turned their noses up at other people that they viewed as worse sinners than themselves. And so in verse 9, it says that Jesus spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves they were righteous and despised others. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee. The other was a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed and said, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, even as this tax collector. Well, you would think that this guy had absolutely no flaws, no weaknesses, no imperfections. So he says, I thank you, because I see all the imperfections of all these other people, but I thank you that I am perfect, is the idea. Here's what I do to prove that I'm perfect. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the tax collector, who was standing afar off, he would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but he beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Here is humility. Here's someone who recognizes that he has weaknesses, and when someone recognizes they have weaknesses, they are poor in spirit, they are in need of God's help and God's grace, you can teach that person. You can help that person. But it's very hard for God to help an arrogant, conceited, self-righteous person. And that's why Jesus says here, this man, the one who beat his breast and said, I'm a sinner, and I've messed up, and I need your help, God. This man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Humble person welcomes correction, knows that they are in need of it. The third thing that I would say humility looks like is, that we see it in a humble person, is humility acknowledges the contributions of other people. Today's Father's Day, and I haven't talked about it a whole lot, but one of the things that I acknowledge on Father's Day is that there's no way I would be where I am today if it weren't for a father and a grandfather who tried to help me get to this point, who tried to teach me the Scriptures and tried to encourage me to stand for what's right, to preach the Scriptures. If it hadn't been for people like that, if it hadn't been for my mother, if it hadn't been for other encouraging Christians who have helped me along the way, if it hadn't been for a godly wife who's sometimes had to straighten me out a time or two as well, if it hadn't been for so many situations that have occurred in my life and that have, I don't think I'd be standing here today if it weren't for their encouragement. And we need to acknowledge other people. Anyone who is successful in life, whether it be some sporty guy, some athlete, whether it be a politician, no matter who it is, they've all needed the help of somebody. There are very few self-made people. And so we need to acknowledge others and acknowledge that other people have helped us and contributed to our success, whatever success there might have been. Romans 12 and verse 10, it says, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love and honor, give preference to one another. And one of the things that I note as I read chapter 16 of Romans is that Paul, he spends an entire chapter here giving credit to all the people who have helped him along the way do the work of an apostle that he did. And so he mentions Phoebe, our sister, in chapter 16 and verse 1. And he mentions Priscilla and Aquila and the experiences that he had with them and who were his fellow workers. He mentions Mary, who labored for us, in verse 6. He mentions some of his countrymen and fellow prisoners in verse 7. He goes on to list person after person all through chapter 16. And really the lesson that we learn from that is that Paul realizes he's not a self-made man. The grace of God was certainly at work in his life, and the grace of God was at work through all of these people who helped contribute to Paul's success in his ministry and in his apostleship. People who had protected him, people who supported him, people who encouraged him, people who worked beside him. And if it wasn't for their help, Paul would not have been as successful as he was in his work. So humble people acknowledge the contributions of others. I was listening to Michael Jordan's Hall of Fame speech, and it was a pretty good speech, really. But one of the things that he did in his Hall of Fame speech when he was inducted a few years ago was he said, I was going to get up here and I was just going to say, thank you, and I was just going to sit back down. He said, but I can't do that, and he went about and he thanked just a ton of people. He started with his brothers and his sister, and he said if it weren't for them, when I was a little kid, fighting me all the time and competing with me and playing with me, if it weren't for them beating me, I would not be the person. It started there. That's one of the points he made. You guys think it started in college when everybody knew him at the University of North Carolina. That started when I was a kid. If it weren't for a mom and a dad who loved me, and he goes on, he talks about, my high school coach cut me when I was a sophomore, even his coach who cut him for somebody else. He said, if it weren't for that may not have fueled my fire. That got me going, got his competitive spirit going. He keeps on going through various people, mentions his college coach, his college teammates, mentions other teammates he played with, and he mentions a lot of the people who he was a fierce competitor with. People like Isaiah Thomas and guys like that, where they didn't really get along on the court, but he said, those people fueled me. One of the things that he acknowledged, though, just simply was that Michael Jordan would not be Michael Jordan if it weren't for so many other people pushing him, whether it be friends or enemies, people encouraging him, or people just pushing him in unique ways. And the same is true for us in our lives. We need to acknowledge that other people in some way, they contribute to our success and thank them. I know Alan's not here tonight, but I'll tell you one thing I remember about Alan when he was at his last banquet, his senior year. A lot of people, maybe some of you don't know, Alan was one of the top scorers at Western history. But one of the things that I remember about the speech that he gave was he thanked the janitors because they let him into the building so he could come shoot when nobody was there. And people that a lot of folks would not even acknowledge or pay attention to always appreciated he paid attention to those people who helped make him successful in a different way, just by giving them the opportunity to be there. I wish those janitors were still as nice today, because I begged to go into the school and they won't let me. But with my kids. But acknowledge others. Acknowledge others. That's what a humble person does. You might also note this, that a humble person acknowledges and experiences victory and failure soberly. Experiences victory and failure soberly. Jesus, when he overturned the tables of the money changers, I'm pretty sure he didn't go around beating his chest. And when he won a debate, when he was having an argument with people who were asking him questions, and he kind of threw one of those zingers that Jesus was pretty famous for throwing out there, one of those questions that nobody could answer, and it got to the point nobody would answer him a word. I don't think Jesus went around beating his chest, talking about how great he was, and pompously declaring, well, I told you. I don't think Jesus was like that with people in his victories. And when it comes to the small victories that we have in life, humble people don't have all that braggadocio and arrogance. It is important for us to realize that we are to contend for the faith as Christians. That means we have to reason with people. We have to persuade them. We have to even argue with them, but argue with them honorably in a way that's not quarrelsome. But it's important for us to realize that as we do so, and even as we sometimes silence them, it's not about some personal war that we're waging. It's not some personal victory we're trying to gain. What we're ultimately trying to do is win people's hearts and minds to Jesus Christ. And when we start pumping our fists and bragging about our great argument and telling other people that they're foolish and stupid because they don't have a response to it, well, we've probably lost at that point. We certainly are acting humbly. So we need to argue with humility. And sometimes we face trials in the church too. Personally, we face trials in our family. We face trials in our church where sometimes bad things happen. Things don't turn out the way that we would like for them to. It's important also that humble people lose with dignity. Look at Philippians chapter 2. And this is really how Paul applied the example of Jesus to the Philippian church. He says, now that you've seen the humility of Jesus and how Jesus dealt with his trials and his problems, and certainly Jesus dealt with a lot of them. He had people that were spitting on him, people who were falsely accusing him. He had friends and disciples who abandoned him. But Jesus, when he's on trial, he doesn't really say anything that he doesn't have to say. He's like a sheep being led to the slaughter. He doesn't point the finger at all of his phony disciples. He doesn't cast blame. He doesn't make excuses for why he's here. He's quiet as he's accused. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 14, the application is made to the church. It says, do all things without complaining and without disputing. Humble people, when bad things do arise, they don't complain about it and they don't dispute and point fingers and blame and backbite when bad things occur. They could learn a lot from Jesus, who came as a servant, who was led as a sheep to the slaughter. We experience victory and failure soberly. We don't let the victories create the big head, if you will, and we don't let the failures lead us into a depression that causes us to quit on our Savior. We need to face life soberly, facing the ups and downs of life with a clear head. 3 more things I want you to see that humble people do. We respect our leaders. 1 Peter 5, verse 5, going back to that, which we read at the outset of the lesson. But 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 5, it says, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. And yes, all of you, be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. Be clothed with humility. What do I do if I'm a humble person? Well, I respect leaders. If I'm a humble person, I respect my parents. My parents might give me some advice and some counsel. I might even be an adult when they give me that advice. I can vouch. My parents are still giving me advice and counsel, even though I'm an adult. I sometimes remind them kindly, I am 37 years old now, but thank you for your advice and counsel. But I need to listen to it. Sometimes they're right, whether I want to hear it or not, or whether you want to hear it or not. So we respect them, and we respect the leadership that they offer to us. So part of being a humble person is you are submissive to one another. You listen to your elders. There's older people here in the church who've been around the block a time or two. Maybe they see danger or see problems. Maybe they are concerned about things in your life. Well, listen to them. Respect them. Humble people are willing to take correction from them. Honor them. Never rip them. All throughout Scripture, it was extremely important that younger people submit to the leadership of elders and they never put them down or rip them. Even Paul says, as he writes to Timothy, he says, you do not receive an accusation against an elder without 2 or 3 witnesses to back it up. Be careful how you speak about those who are older than you and your parents. Make sure that you respect them. What did Jesus do? This is a good WWJD principle. Jesus came to earth. He said, not my will. God, I'm not sure about this. Some of this seems very scary to me. What you're asking me to do to go to a cross. Jesus was concerned. He was worried, but not my will, but thine be done. But I'm going to trust you. And he obeyed it. He respected his Father. Two more things. Humble people serve. They pick up a towel and they serve. If you're trying to be like Jesus, that's what Jesus did. He came to earth in John chapter 13. We read about Jesus as he's gathered with his disciples for one of the last few times. In verse 2, it says, supper had ended. The devil had put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray him. And Jesus, knowing the Father had given all things to his hands, that he had come from God, that he was going to God. Think about that phrase. Jesus, knowing he was from God and he was going to God, while he was here on earth, he still served. It says that he rose from supper, he laid aside his garments, he took a towel, and he girded himself. He poured water into a basin, he began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. Humble people aren't afraid to serve. If there's some area where service is needed, even though it might be dirty, look, washing feet is not, especially in a culture like this where you have dirt roads and feet are dirty and grimy and perhaps smelly. Washing feet's not the most, this isn't a salon he's in, all right? He takes his clothes off because his clothes would have gotten very dirty. He knew he was going to get dirty. This is a dirty, nasty job. And Jesus lays aside his garments, takes up a towel, and washes the feet of his disciples. And he says to them later in verse 14, if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Humble people serve. Humble people serve. There's a story about Booker T. Washington back in his hometown. He was walking down the street one day. And as he was walking down the street, there was a very wealthy white lady who came out and said to him, hey, son, I was needing some wood chopped, some firewood chopped, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to do that. And Booker T. Washington just looked at her and smiled and said, well, sure, I can go do that. Doesn't mention who he is, doesn't mention anything like that. He chops the wood. He even says, hey, can I carry this into your house and set it by your fireplace? He carries it into her house, sets it by her fireplace. And as he goes into the house, there's a little girl in the house who recognized him, who he was, and tells her mom, and Booker T. Washington just goes home, and later the woman comes into his office and says, I am so sorry. I didn't realize who you were. I can't believe I did that. He just said, that's all right. It's all right. I like to chop some wood every once in a while and work. He laid aside himself and he just served. Later, that woman became, with some of her friends, financial donors to the Tuskegee Institute, and helped out that particular institute on behalf of Booker T. Washington's character. She tells him, you really won some fans through me and through other people by being willing to do that, not bragging on who you were. Humility picks up a towel, it serves. And finally, it gives glory to God. A humble person realizes that whatever success we've had in life, whether it be financial or spiritual, business success, family success, whatever success we've had, our talent, the people that we have around us, every good and every perfect gift, it comes from God. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 30, Paul, as he writes to Corinth, he says in verse 30 there, he says, of him you are in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, that as it is written, he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. We have absolutely no reason to glory and be prideful ourselves. All that we are and all that we can be and will be, we need to give glory and credit to God. And on a spiritual sense, everything that we are and do in his kingdom is because of him. And He deserves all glory and honor and praise. Humble people give glory to God. They don't credit themselves for all these things. That's what humility looks like. It takes humility to yield to the Father's will, to obey His plan for our salvation. I want to leave you with an illustration. In the summer of 1986, there were two ships that collided in the Black Sea off of the coast of Russia. Hundreds of passengers died as they were hurled into the icy waters below. News of the disaster was further darkened when an investigation revealed the cause of the accident. It wasn't a technology problem like the radar went bad or wasn't thick fog or anything like that. The cause was human stubbornness. Each captain was aware of the other ship's presence nearby. Both could have steered clear, but according to news reports, neither captain wanted to give way to the other. Each person was too proud to yield first. And by the time they came to their senses, it was too late. This very night, I want to ask, if you're someone who's not obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ and you know what God requires of you so that you might be saved and be in a right relationship with Him, don't be overcome with stubbornness or pride. Humbly submit to the will of our Savior as you obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, who became poor, so you might be given the greatest of riches, eternal life. Will you humble yourself to Him now as together we stand and while we sing?